So we don't have a real formal agenda for this evening, but we wanted to take advantage of the fact that we had at least a couple of people here that are on the board, and actually Sean, who's another fellow board member, is on the hangout with us, along with a couple other folks. So we'll at least got 3 direct members of the board to sort of listen. So we, as part of the OpenStack board, one of the things that, and Rob actually reminded me today that this is a charter in the bylaws of the OpenStack Foundation, is it's our duty to sort of to define what core is in OpenStack. And there's a lot of really important reasons that we need to define core. It has to do with how we brand things. It has to do with some of the legal protections that we'd like to set up around the software and the patents that are involved in OpenStack. And it obviously has a pretty big influence on things like interoperability and building the kind of larger ecosystem that I think we believe OpenStack has the potential to do. So, we kind of kicked this discussion off in the February board meeting, and it's been evolving as a board topic, and then we brought the TC in, and then a few weeks ago we started opening it up to get more and more community input to try to evolve this. And really, I think a lot of this is about starting out as a point of how are we even going to define what core is? How are we going to measure whether you follow that definition or not? And really at this very high level, sort of the mechanics around how you think about core, and less around what's actually in that definition once we define it, right? So this is more of a discussion of things like how are we going to test for whether you're part of core, what components of OpenStack might you have to have, and really the process around sort of managing and maintaining that. And as we talk about it, as you sort of keep that in mind, because I think one of the things Rob in particular has found that's very easy to dive into a lot of low-level detail in the weeds pretty quickly, and we will have to get there eventually, but if we can start kind of peeling the onion at the outer side and working our way down, we think there's some potential to make some progress. And I think maybe to start with, we can have Rob kind of kick off kind of an introduction to sort of where we are, and then just see what questions you guys have or thoughts or inputs you have into the process.
So just as a show of hands, how many people are familiar with the core discussion? Okay, how many people have seen the flowchart that, okay, good. So the thing that, we want to get to a point where we can have a discussion about this. What I found in having discussions with people is that if we don't set the table, we go off really in the weeds, which is how this all started, because the board was having a lot of trouble discussing what is core, and we have to actually describe what is core for legal reasons, and not just for practical about what the project's about. And the debate sort of ends up had sounded a lot like this. It's like, well, this has to be in core, it's an absolutely required part. Well, if you do that, then this has to be in core, or that shouldn't be in core. And we get this very circular argument, right? And people would be, well, I don't want this, I don't want us to not be innovative. We want to have all this stuff, and if you do that, it's going to be, nobody's going to want to contribute to the project. And so we had these big round and round discussions about it. And with the board, especially with 24 people on the board, the only way we resolve problems is we come up with a schema for discussion first, if that makes sense. Working with a board of 24 people is a big challenge. And so what we've done with this discussion is we're not going to say what is core tonight, right? This is probably the hardest statement that anybody's going to, that's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is figure out how we determine what is core. Right, the meta conversation. And the reason why that's really important is because that then lets us discuss in a very rational way, well, this is core, this isn't core. And so we've been working through this process to try and help people understand that. So that's the first thing, is to not to walk away saying, oh, now I know exactly what's in core, not in core. One of the other reasons you won't get that answer is because we're at the vetting phase. So the things we talk about tonight are all open for discussion, right? There's points in this, there's positions here. We've intentionally described it as positions because it gets people's attention and it helps the dialogue go. If we actually say, here's what we're thinking, then here's a whole bunch of questions we want to answer. But every single thing we've presented, single thing we've done so far has very much been responding to feedback, bringing things out. We had some language that when we showed this process to the PTLs and the TC, they were allergic might be the right word.
We're not mandating plugins as part of core. Let's just say that.
There's right, and it's really it's a very diverse community, and there's a lot of things that we have to consider in what we're going. And the community is going to continue to get diverse. And the last thing we want to do in defining core is make anybody feel like they're not part of the community, right? And that's one of the biggest liabilities. The other thing that hopefully you'll walk away from this understanding is that it's not there's no. Not being a core component in OpenStack is not a walk of shame, right? This is one of the biggest things is there's a lot of people who are like, if I'm not core, I'm not important anymore. And that's not the purpose of defining core. The purpose of defining core is about interoperability, it's about maintainability, it's about people knowing what they can count on, what's necessary. Just because a project isn't core, that doesn't mean that project isn't part of OpenStack. It really is very narrowly defined, but it's also a very helpful thing for us to understand. And I'll give you a hometown example for this. Rackspace doesn't operate dashboard, which by the current definition, according to the bylaws, is core, and you must use, right? They have their own variant of Keystone for good reasons. Makes perfect sense. But that's also a core project. So if you're going to say I'm an OpenStack cloud or I'm deploying OpenStack and you don't use core components, you are out of compliance. You actually couldn't make that claim. And so there's some shades of gray and all this stuff, but that's why it's important, right? People want to be able to say we want the OpenStack trademark to mean something. And this opens up some cans of worms that we were discussing earlier today about maybe what are implications on how we use the trademark and what it means and things like that. And we'll get there. That's sort of the secondary point. But the goal here is to get everybody's feedback. Please bring up projects. Okay, just because we can't say this is core or not core, we're not going to definitively answer it. It is the most effective exercise for somebody to say, I think Heat should be core. This happens to me twice a week, right? I think this project should be core, and and then test it to see if this answer, if we're like, okay, if you think it should be core, can we answer why it is or why it isn't, right? Would you be able to effectively lobby your case and how that would be so there's all that. It's a lot of ground setting, but okay. And you know what? I can actually do this. I'm gonna turn the screen. I'm gonna turn my screen around so you guys can see it, and then I'm gonna share it at the same time.
So I'm hearing that the definition of core is intrinsic to the trademark issue.
It is in that the only thing we have. Do you guys mind scooting over? Since we're not that big, it'd be a lot easier if I do that.
Just don't block. Yeah.
Or me.
I like this Jedi Council thing.
Instead, you just bump the camera so it's
Maybe we should move the camera to the table that no one's sitting at.
The problem is that there's no out over there.
Oh, they all know.
That's cool. I've got one happily sitting perched on my shoulder too. So this is the main stream. So I'm going to try and go through this. This is the end result of a lot of discussions and dialogues and back and forth with the board and board members and the TC and PTLs and now the community. And so, right, one of the things I'm going to ask all of you is, raise your concerns, bring these things up. If you feel like we're addressing the concerns and this is reasonable and you're being heard, say it, right? Part of the factor in all this stuff is that you're representing not just your positions but the community's positions. And if you think there's something that we're doing that doesn't smell right, we need you to bring it up. And if you don't feel comfortable here, you sleep on it, bring it up in Twitter, bring it up in the list, bring it up, right?
Speaking of bringing something like
drives me nuts. All right. Don't show this message again. I said that before. All right, so I know you can't see this, and I'll walk you through it to make it a little bit easier. The way this works is we start from the position that OpenStack Core is you must use Core to get the trademark. not necessarily interlinked, but they're the only way that OpenStack can enforce it. We had a really funny quote, which is, how do you make sure all this stuff works? And we said, trust, then lawyers. So the idea is, we don't want to police, we're not trying to create an OpenStack police state, but at the end of the day, if people don't comply, OpenStack can sue somebody for misuse of not using the trademark correctly, right? Not a desirable position.
And I think one element that pops up out of this that we can get into the appropriate time is whether or not there's one trademark, and for instance, obviously there's one OpenStack mark, but is there OpenStack mark per components? Is there an OpenStack compatible mark, which is different than like an OpenStack powered mark? And a lot of things that go with that that are completely open for discussion. What we're focused on right now is that core, the sort of what you say, I'm running OpenStack, which is this core piece. There may be other components that would potentially go with that.
Running OpenStack versus I'm providing OpenStack. Like
Well,
I can run OpenStack underneath something and have a completely different API on top of it. And
Or
that would be
the one that
So
reverse of that pops up sometimes is I support the OpenStack API without any OpenStack code through some other service. What is that?
Right.
We'll get in. That'll make more
So
sense.
yeah,
as it goes further.
it actually the best thing I could suggest is that I walk through these 10 points and you let me do it. I can do it in 5 minutes, and then we open up the discussion to whichever points you guys want to discuss. Okay? Because I guarantee you. We will
It makes more sense.
bog down into this. So here's, and a lot of these points they intentionally build on each other. So the first thing in this is that that's the enforcement mechanism, right? Core is a subset, right? I already talked about this. You shouldn't get your feelings hurt if you're not core, you're still OpenStack. So we're not trying to describe 100% of the code base. That can be applied to any application. So the definition of core should not be core for hosters and core for, at this point, right? What we're trying to define is core that is common across all use cases. Okay? That doesn't mean that we might not refine. And then the next set are all technical related. The first one is that it requires that you actually deploy some OpenStack code. Right? That is a requirement that drives a community. Actually, I didn't preface this. One of the things that I test these with, and I test the dialogues with, is are we driving the right behaviors for the community? I want to define core because we need to do that. There's a lot of commercial interests. But if we define core in a way that doesn't encourage a collaborative community around OpenStack, or doesn't encourage people to contribute code and make the project better, we failed. So there's a test in all this, and please help apply this test, that what we're doing is actually adding to the body of knowledge for this. Okay, and then so one of the things that people feel very adamantly about is that you must include OpenStack as part of the definition for this. Right? So that's, or OpenStack code. How do you know which OpenStack code or not? It's up to the leaders in the project. It's a technical decision, where there's an expectation that they will identify a section of the code that say, you must use this part of the code. It is required. Part of the thing we were talking about that helps drive is it actually helps make sure that people are still contributing back things into OpenStack. There's some board members who are very adamant about this position. It's an interesting one. And then we branch. There must be an open source reference implementation. Okay? That's expected, right? Doesn't have to have every bell and whistle. Well, we'd have to have all the core bells and whistles. You're not going to have something in core that's not in the open source reference implementation. And we also allow people to have alternate implementations, right? In the past, we called these plugins or extensions or things like that. We're much simpler than that. The technical leaders of that project say, this is a place, this is the reference implementation, here's the required code, here's places you can substitute. Some projects call those plugins, some projects might designate it just by lines of code. I don't care. It's up to the technical group to do it. But we're expecting that you'll have reference implementation that's open as part of the OpenStack project, and people can substitute in alternate implementations.
Wants to keep a project from saying, this is the code base, and it's all of it.
We're having that conversation in some cases, and one of them, I'm going to answer that in a couple ways to answer it. One is just social pressure and the pressure of this being the definition of core, but it also is a necessary thing just to evolve the code base. So if somebody says, I want to change part of how the code operates, and we need a way to have an alternate, oh, I can use this or that, right? I can use Rabbit or 0MQ. And so, I mean, even that's a reasonable place to say, okay, we allow you to use whatever queuing system you want, or hypervisor that you want, or file system that you want underneath the covers. So not every project can do it. Oslo it might not make any sense for that. And they might say, there is none, and we would say, okay, that's fine. It doesn't technically make sense. We are not trying to judge that. But our goal is that you can have an alternate implementation in places.
I thought Oslo was a program.
Oslo is a common API library underneath.
Right.
So
Everything's
considered a
program
program
at
and
this
not a
point.
project. Or,
Right.
yeah, there's some. They've differentiated between the programs and the projects at the TC level, I think, which we'd have to figure out where that flows in. But I think it was just broadly saying is there could be a situation where we started initially was by saying that every project had to support plugins. Where we got pushed back was they felt like that was too prescriptive from an architectural detail, so we're trying to figure out the right wording, but the basic idea is there has to be components that can be differentiable or have some replaceable pieces within them, whether that's done through plugins or exactly what decision, but we do believe there needs to be flexibility. And to date, most of the major projects fit that bill, right? You've got the hypervisors that you can switch out in Nova, you've got all the different storage backends that are supported by Cinder, you've got all the different plugins supported by Neutron, and so I don't think this is, people generally disagree that you're going to have some level of differentiation, and that's really what we were trying to capture with these concepts.
Does it mean that the reference implementation has to have multiple implementations, or just that it has to be possible to be extended?
No, what we're basically saying is there needs to be something you can get where you can basically download off the web that's free and open source, where you can build a complete, functional, viable, working platform. And there needs to be a way for people who want to potentially take that and differentiate it in some way and still fall into the core. I mean, that is the logical concept we're trying to get to. And what we don't want to do is make it so that you have to buy vendor plugins to get a project to work, right? There's no open source alternative or no viable open source alternative. But we also don't want to sort of say it's 100% of this particular open source stack for everybody.
Right.
And so we're trying to figure out the right way to find the middle ground, and this is, I think, our best capture of that concept.
Right. And we expect these things to evolve, right? Once again, we're trying to figure out how to make the decision in it. But,
And, sorry, speaking of which, in terms of the technical leaders defining which set of code within their project, that you have to run this bit of code to be, defined as using that project, then how does that evolve over time? When a new project leader comes in and says, oh, you know what, that old definition, garbage, we're doing something totally different and just going a whole new direction. How do these things evolve over time?
that actually would be how they evolve over time. So if a PTL who would come in and make that type of wholesale change, actually, let me keep going.
Sure.
That actually, yes, it is a risk, definitely a risk. And so the next step down actually gets us out of code and into testing. So the idea here is that this code is verified by community tests. Okay, it doesn't say Tempest specifically. Tempest is definitely one of the candidates, but we could have a broader range of tests than that. But the idea is the OpenStack community maintains tests by which these projects are verified. Okay, which is great behavior. We want to encourage that. And then the expectation is these aren't just tests that run in the lab. They're tests that can be self-administered or remotely administered. So if you're familiar with RefStack, the idea would be you could take a cloud and point RefStack at it, and it would run the tests. Or if you were a private cloud, you could run the test suite yourself and get a result, right? And part of this is people are like, well, how do I know I have an OpenStack lab? You have to be able to run the tests against it, right? For the stuff I do, we actually include Tempest in our project, right? I'm lead on the Crowbar project, and Tempest is one of the components, and after you do an install, you can run Tempest and validate that, yes, I actually have an OpenStack cloud that passes Tempest. So that validation is part of this conceptual framework, right? And then the next thing is, well, wait a second, you don't have to pass 100% of those tests. Right? There are going to be tests that are new or for different components, or it is perfectly reasonable that you don't pass 100% of the tests. There's only some of them that we have to identify as must-pass tests. Okay? And those must-pass tests, the final box here, is that the must-pass tests define OpenStack Core.
So that's RefStack.
It's not RefStack is just at this bottom layer. It's a way to test OpenStack.
It would be a subset of RefStack.
Okay, so like RefStack, some subsection of
Yeah,
RefStack
so the
that
idea
says
is-
you must pass these to be.
Yeah.
So-
There'd be some definition that says, okay, there's 100 tests in RefStack. We've identified these 75 that represent core.
Mhm.
If you pass these 75, you can show the score for all 100. But to get core, you have to be these 75.
So you get an F if you don't pass those or whatever it is.
Well, this is a trick.
That's
I don't.
that's the
It
current
shouldn't.
thinking, right?
This is a really important point. It shouldn't be an F, right? Because this is where if it's not core, it's okay. It could be that a project like Heat isn't core, and your deployment passes all the Heat tests. Great. It should show up as a benefit in RefStack, right, or in your score, but it doesn't make you any more OpenStack Core than somebody else. This is the list you must pass to be OpenStack Core. And RefStack would probably have a checkbox that says, hey, core, this map passes all the core tests.
Right.
But if you pass more, or even if you pass less, that might be okay,
But if
depending
you
on
pass
what
less,
type
you
of
wouldn't be
company.
able to use the mark.
Correct.
Yes.
So this implies that these tests won't really be focused on implementation works or anything at all except for fairly high level.
That's an
API
excellent.
behavior
No. That's an excellent question. I'm going to turn. Do people need to keep seeing this? Because I was going to turn. So, sorry. Let me play camera mode for just a second. So here's the idea with that, and this is where it gets really interesting, is that if you have things that are specialized tests that maybe only work for one module, say that the Microsoft team writes Hyper-V specific tests that only pass if you've deployed Hyper-V. Great, they're not likely to become must-pass tests. But I would love to have them in the community of tests, because if I'm deploying Hyper-V, I want to test it. So this is where the concept of the must-pass test is really interesting. And this is really what we start getting into with a very demonstratable version of core. Because at that point, I can actually collect statistics, particularly we're talking about this today. I could actually look at a trend on it. I could collect data from the community, which is really what we want to be able to do, and see in the field, oh, these tests are passing in 90% of my deployments. They're likely core tests. Or these were only 20%, but in the Icehouse release, they moved from 20 to 40, right? And people started investing in making sure that passed. And then you can start making arguments that because tests are use cases, these use cases are important to the community. We want to make sure they pass. And if they're not passing in a lot of places, then you could make arguments that they're not passing.
So the idea would be that gets updated on the same release cycle, so that we have a new set for Havana, a new set for Icehouse, a new set.
And that's already the case, right? The tests are part of the release cycle.
Yeah, but I think what he's bringing up, which is I think a good point, is the diagram currently doesn't capture kind of how core evolves over time. So is there a new definition of core each release cycle, and then it's static for that release cycle, or is it can core change more frequently than the release cycle, or more slowly than the release cycle?
It's a really good, and in the details down in here, we actually had a discussion around this. The idea is that on release day, there is a body of tests. If your deployment passes on release day with the tests that are included in the release, you can claim OpenStack Core for that release, right? And we need to differentiate the mark, and this is some of the things are going to fall out of this, like what you can claim. But if you can pass all the core tests, must-pass tests, on your deployment of product, at some point you can claim your OpenStack trademark. And so, right, and we're going to have to work through how much we need to say this release or that release or things like that. I expect users to be pretty savvy about what release they're buying of a product or what release they're using of a product.
Do any
I
of
think
these?
what
I don't know.
I think what we definitely don't want to do is be in a situation where, let's say you guys have deployed a Havana release, and then Icehouse pops out, and you can't call yourself OpenStack until you catch up to Icehouse, right? And that certainly can't happen. I also don't think we want 15 different OpenStack certifications available at the same time, so I don't know how we're going to balance that.
Yeah, and the ultimate problem is if somebody's trying to track much more closely to trunk and things are changing in that release cycle that are going to inherently change the definition of core, do you all of a sudden become not core because you're not keeping up with the latest release cycle and you're keeping closer to trunk? Do you somehow lose your coreness and then get back at the next release?
So well, I think I'm hopeful that, and I realize this, I mean, to some degree we're going to have to trust that the community is going to be rational.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and this kind of gets back to Everett's earlier, question about sort of changing the definition of core. So when it comes in, I mean, really we have these same risks today, right? Any PTL has the right to completely rewrite the API anytime they become elected, PTL. But I think most people within the community realize that shifting the API radically every release would be suicide for the project, and it doesn't happen. I think we have to sort of assume that core, while it may evolve, I mean, I'm hoping we get towards a point where we don't have backward compatibility issues with API, where we don't, where core evolves but in a forward direction, not a backward. I mean, these kind of things don't happen, and I realize there's a lot of hope there, but I also think if those are the kinds of behaviors we have to enforce by the board imposing rules on everybody, we've got a bigger problem as a community. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't be aware of them, and we should talk about them. I just think we can't, if we overprotect by defining this so narrowly and mandating stuff that we can strain things, I think that the unintended consequences of that would be worse than the real risk of like some kind of upheaval where somebody sneaks into a PTL. Because the reality is if a PTL changes something, it's probably because a large body of people in the project felt like something needed to be changed, and the community elected that person, and it was done for the right reason, right? And in which case maybe it's okay.
You get rogue dictators and PTLs.
Well, and part of the reason for having the self-test and reference test in this definition is that if I buy a product from somebody and they claim that it supports OpenStack and a version, I can go test it, right? This is to me, we're really based on, hey, you sold me a bill of goods, I ran the test suite and it didn't pass. One of the things that's interesting with this is this also comes back to if I have an alternate implementation, right? If I have a Quantum plugin that I claim works, and the expectation would be it works at least as well as the reference implementation. There's a really interesting exit clause for this, which allows somebody who has a non-compliant implementation to ship with the reference implementation, and then say, well, you can turn a switch and use our non-compliant implementation. And that actually would allow you, that's one of the ways. So say like you had an infrastructure that didn't use Keystone. Somebody had a solution that didn't use Keystone. They could ship it with Keystone turned on, allow it to pass all the tests, and then the customer at their own choice could then turn on alternate implementation that didn't pass the tests. But once again, we're trying to make it very easy for buyers to make an informed decision, which to me is.
Well, so you have this idea of having a reference implementation, and you swap out the implementations. It seems like this idea has it puts a lot of emphasis on the tests, right? The tests are going to become so important, they're going to become basically the API contract, which I've always thought they should be. But here's the thing. If you allow different implementations, rather than saying, well, you can switch it to the reference one and then just go back and use yours, I feel like that sort of leaves a strange opening. What about saying there's going to be ways to make the tests themselves pluggable? Because I think that oftentimes the problem with the tests today, I think it would be almost impossible. I mean, it's going to take a lot of elbow grease to just say, yeah, I just pointed to that thing and it'll work. The first thing you're going to get is, I tried it and all of them came back red. Because there's just like a small, there's just little tiny discrepancies.
Totally.
There's got to be like, if you're going to define some code as required and others as that you can vary, then the tests that cover the required stuff have to be the ones that must pass, and the ones that are the varied are the ones that maybe, maybe totally. Not. Is that going to be like the design? Is that going to be like, I don't want to say enforced, but the goal that everyone's going to have is that if this is required code, those are the tests that must pass?
Yes. The idea is there would be no reference implementation that didn't pass the must pass tests. Okay. Right? Which is not the case for all of our projects right now. There are capabilities that are in Neutron that aren't fully implemented or haven't in previous releases weren't fully implemented for the reference implementation. one of the cultures we want to drive is that while the reference implementation might not scale as much or be as performant, you should have all the features, right? You're not going to have a test that must pass that's not in the reference implementation.
So I also think
that
it does-
brings up, sorry, another point.
Yep.
With the test, do any of these tests take into account quality of service?
So this is this is a really fun question because it opens up a great can of worms.
I'm sure, yeah.
I would love to see tests that do take into account quality of service, right? The question, so the more tests we have, the better. The more things they test, the better. The question becomes, do those tests become must-pass tests? So I can entirely see the body of OpenStack tests, including quality of service tests or redundancy, object redundancy tests, and making sure that you have fault tolerance. All those tests would be wonderful tests to have. You could have white box tests. You can do all sorts of things. The question is, when do those become must-pass? And so that's a question that actually drives this conversation. And then you can start arguing, oh, I have a test here that says I have a quality of service guarantee for OpenStack. I think that must pass.
But in terms of the quality of service tests, it'd be nice to see if they weren't binary, pass or fail, that there would actually be a grade, and then you could actually use that as more data gathering in the community for the quality of the OpenStack that's out there.
And so part of what I'm hoping all this drives is the creation of tests like that, and then potentially, the user committee, whoever starts nominating these tests as must pass, would actually be able to say, this test is a must pass with a score of 30 or above, or something like that. But it's based on rational things, right? This is in the field, most customers have this score, we feel like this is a criteria. What we're trying to do is stop arguing about whether or not dashboard is a core project or not, and say, of these tests, of the dashboard tests, most deployments pass them, and they make sense. Or if I was an ecosystem partner that integrated against the dashboard, then I could lobby, hey, I think this is a must-pass test, and then you could have a discussion that's very tightly bound on that use case, which is the goal.
So does this mean that this spec of tests, I guess, that after a release is cut, that the period of time before the tests are really solidified goes on longer than that? Because let's say someone's like, okay, I just deployed, Havana, but guys, I swear I've set it up the same way, and these tests are failing on my deployment. I don't think this is really fair. I can't even really get to the bulk of them because of some issue. I would like to make this suggestion or this pull request to the test. Is that kind of thing being considered?
And that is the current state, right? We definitely see this in the Grizzly tests. Tempest was not passing all tests for our deployments until it's still not passing 100% of the tests, which is okay. We're not trying to do that. I think it's going to come back to which tests are must-pass tests, and some of those. I would expect the must-pass tests will be there at the release mark.
I guess what I'm saying is the idea that the tests have to execute against that exact deployment. So like the same one that's being offered to customers.
It's a great question.
Like on the same hardware, what's the?
There's a stipulation deep inside of the conversation we were having over this, was that for when a vendor certifies against this, and I need to make sure this ends up surfaced, I think it is that the vendor is also responsible for publishing the reference architecture they certified against. And that drove, Randy Bias was really involved in this, and this is an important point from him. And it's fun because there's actually, a lot of these positions have legacies back to specific board members who have very, very good community rationale for this. And the conversation goes, well, we need to have OpenStack reference architecture so people don't have to argue about it. And the idea was you could either certify against one of the published, accepted OpenStack reference architectures. That's going to be a bear to resolve, but eventually there probably will be some. Or I've published my reference architecture so that you could hopefully re-implement the tests. Because we do not, and this was a conversation, we do not want to create a market necessarily for OpenStack core certification consultants. If that might happen, that'd be great. I'd love to see marketplaces develop. We don't want to create the requirement for one.
I think the other thing that's implicit in this is that the RefStack effort and the testing effort has to evolve to look in the real world. I think if you look today at like the Tempest tests that typically run on DevStack, which has almost no relationship to the way people actually use OpenStack, and so this is why the RefStack, which is a parallel effort, is actually somewhat critical. Is that RefStack with a multi-node, one or more real-world looking type applications needs to be in this part of the process, because what you can't do is vet the test on DevStack and then go point it at HP in an HP availability zone and then complain that this bunch of VMs running on a laptop worked fine and he doesn't get to be OpenStack, right? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So at a minimum, we have to have a testing ground where this stuff's being developed that, while may never be representative of every world scenario, I think it needs to be way further along than what we use today.
And it could also represent a big cost or burden if you have to tell a company, hey, I know you're about to release, you've put a lot of resources into this, but we really need you to switch to the reference implementation for certain things, or else the test just won't pass.
It's the PCI problem.
Something like
I think we want to avoid that.
It's just not acceptable. So this is why, if you tell us what you tested on, that's part of the idea here, then great. But what we don't want is, hey, I have this secret sauce black box implementation. I promise you it worked. And we're back to letting the market.
We also want to be very open. Like if a test is broken, like we think a test works, and then all of a sudden, we roll it out, and 70% of the people who were certified last week can't pass the test, then there's got to be a discussion about, is the test broken? Should that not be a not pass? What's the reality?
So there must be some grace period built in for people who have marks now. You're not going to have to change it if a test breaks next week.
Yeah, and certainly in the early days, there's going to be a lot of experimentation around this whole idea.
And if you pass it, you can claim the mark. We're trying to not be fuzzy like this because we don't want to create moving targets.
But for how long, I guess?
For that release.
Right, so say if I'm good for Grizzly, I deploy Havana and it breaks, how long do I lose my mark on that day? Or do I have
you wouldn't be able to claim, and we're still working out the details on this, but the thinking is that you wouldn't be able to claim the Grizzly mark until you can pass all the tests for the Grizzly release.
Okay, so the idea is that there's separate marks for each release.
No.
The idea is up in the air.
Well,
that's
part of the
we need
problem
to
too,
resolve
is
this.
how do you identify, is what name we release going to have to be, sufficient to work within a trademark? So, what OpenStack Clouds want to advertise? We are OpenStack Icehouse.
Continuous deployment now, and I'm in the middle of Icehouse and Havana, or Havana and Icehouse, I guess. And now my Havana tests are breaking because I took a point release of Icehouse. But I wanted to do that. Do I have to get rid of my trademark?
I'm
No.
curious to know how.
Once you've got it, you've got you. And guys, we can go down this. I'm happy to keep talking about it, but we're going down a little bit of a rabbit hole. And here's the deal, because at some point we expect customers to be pretty savvy about this, and we expect people to post their results and act like grown-ups. So you can try and cheat. If you are a company that's cheating these results, you're going to get busted really fast. If you're a private individual and you use the test to make sure that you're interoperable with other clouds, you're going to make those decisions based on what you're making them for. And so we're trying not to create a lot of rules around that until we need them. If we need them, we'll add them.
I think the idea is it's not like a gotcha mentality. Like, you failed the test, get rid of that. Yeah, it's not like that.
Just
it's
the
just
opposite.
the idea of contributing so that if your tests start breaking, figure out why, contribute the solutions back, let other people who might be on a similar architecture know about the issue, and so that they can then take it back.
What I really want to have happen is I want to have everybody who's building OpenStack products, right, and doing OpenStack deployments be really invested in running the tests on their deployment, because then the tests get better, the code gets better, we've made sure the tests are more robust. If you're in a situation where you get into a case and it's you're a month after the release and something blows up because you haven't run the tests until then because you're about to release, shame on you, right? So what the dynamic that I'm hoping, this now I'm back to culture, the culture I'm trying to foster with this is that everybody in the OpenStack community is using the tests to benchmark their deployments of OpenStack, because that drives really positive behavior, contributions to tests, early tests, right? Deployment, sharing deployment details and things like that, that we actually helps the community a lot. And that's, I'll step back and I'll mirror something that Monty's been really good, Monty Taylor's been really good about trying to drive. He wants to make sure that everything we do in our definition encourages people to contribute back to the open source project, right? Point number 4 in this, which is you must deploy OpenStack, is one of the things he feels very strongly about, because what he doesn't want somebody to do is implement the APIs and then walk away. We want to have a reason for people, even if they've re-implemented the APIs, to still be active in the source code in the project, and not just take our spec, right, and say, hey, thanks, thank you for defining this thing and building a market for us, but we're not going to contribute in your community anymore.
So I have a quick question. Are there any other, I guess, real world examples of large open source bodies that have had to do this before? And I'm curious to know, what are some of the other, if I think of something like Cassandra, I don't necessarily think of we're allowed to run a powered by, and you guys are only allowed to run a used by, or this version of this release, or something like that. It seems a lot, it almost seems like it's getting close to AGPLing a brand in a way.
Why? I have an answer for your first question, but why does it feel like it's AGPL?
Just because it seems incredibly stringent to say, you have to follow these 19 rules, and we have to vet you with a whole bunch of tests.
But you don't. I mean, you don't have to if you want to use the trademark. Yeah, you have to. But you can deploy OpenStack and never use the trademark. Nobody cares.
So private cloud wouldn't care or whatever. I mean,
Yeah, private cloud wouldn't care, right? If I want to go out and implement, an Amazon compatible cloud on top of OpenStack, I could do that and never even expose the
I think a reasonable comparison might be like the Hadoop ecosystem, right? So like Cassandra is easy to kind of, because it's just like one thing, right? But like there's 87,000 Hadoop projects, and they all work with each other, and they all whatever, right? And they're all created by separate people, and all that kind of stuff. And so when you say I run Hadoop, it means nothing when you go and actually talk to someone who does it, right? Is it Cloudera, which is completely different from the Hadoop open stuff? You're talking about, HBase or whatever. Like,
I guess it doesn't matter more because it's more of a managed thing. Because if you're running Hadoop, you're probably running it for your own data analytics purposes.
Like somebody needs to buy
that,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think it gets back to why this is important, because I think one thing we're trying to get is different, and it's the whole issue of interoperability, right? So that's why, in most cases, as a vendor, right, if you're the only guy who can pass the test, it's a good thing because you say I'm differentiated, right? In this case, if only 1 out of 10 implementations pass, that's a bad thing. And there's no interoperability whatsoever. So.
On core, right? If you add, I'll go back to my fictitious Hyper-V example. If you're a product that's differentiated and you add 10 tests or 100 tests that only pass for you, and the PTL, and they come in the community and they rock on, right? What you've done is you've actually made it possible for people to validate that your functionality works, but they don't necessarily become core.
So by that same example, like let's say there's a Hyper-V like driver or something, and then the actual reference tests, lots of the tests depend on features that cannot be possible in Hyper-V. So then what's the solution there? Does whoever's doing that, I think they need to have an outlet to say, hey, this really isn't fair, we can't, unless this is going to be part of the system, in which case you're actually disallowing a different implementation. These simply can't be part of the spec.
Core tests.
Yeah.
Well, that's where I think the discussion of the must-have test becomes important, because you can't. On the one hand, we're sitting there saying, well, you can have these sort of, I'll use the term pluggable, some mechanism that's replaceable, but your test then don't actually allow it. Then you're actually fooling yourself. You're not. If KVM is the only hypervisor that works, then nothing. Then
right.
But,
sort of kill the whole point.
we're also allowing for somebody to say, I'm going to ship you a Hyper-V cloud that doesn't pass core tests, but I'm including the KVM module so that it will. And that's why that's an alternate.
If it includes the KVM module, then again, would they have to switch to the KVM driver on their deployment to pass the test? Or
If they were, so this is where we get back into commercial enablement. Because one of the things that
There's also the
we're
difference
trying to
between
do.
shipping and service. I mean, because what you're describing is somebody who's shipping a product for a customer to deploy, and you give them a switch. It's different if you're in the service environment offering a cloud with Hyper-V. You're obviously
That would be a nightmare.
You can't be, you're not necessarily going to be running, but giving the customer the option at the service time of flipping their hypervisor most likely. And I think that's where probably where that's a trickier issue. I think we fail if we start defining a bunch of tests that only work with one hypervisor, only work with one storage system. If those become the must-have tests, then we need to quit kidding
So we see that
ourselves.
now with features like that are landed, they require them for something like that, so they'll work on KVM, but they won't work consent.
Right.
And
My
so
hope
if that
is-
feature, if that test became must pass, then all of a sudden anybody who's not running KVM is out.
Yeah, but that was the point I was making before, the correlation between the must pass and the invariant.
And I feel like in
If it's
some
a
cases-
plug-in, if it's a plug-in based test, then it really shouldn't be must pass.
I think it goes back to then what, it kind of goes back to what is core, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think the argument could be made, how a feature of a hypervisor shouldn't be core, right?
Right.
What should be core is, do all the hypervisors interact with Nova and use certain components of Nova?
If I make this
the
call,
same
then I
way?
get a server, can I SHH, can I
But-
SHH
Or
do it?
does
well-
it use Nova scheduler?
But this is where I'm really excited about, because OpenStack favors implementation over API, and it might be there's certain extensions in the API that everybody's like, well, everybody uses them, so they're probably want to make them defaults. And so one of the things that we can do is if most of the deployments are using certain key features that hypervisors implement, and you can go back and say, our data shows 80%, 90% of customers pass this test, most deployments pass this test, and there's this one hypervisor that doesn't, and so you can say, you know what, we actually have a community who relies on this feature. We're gonna actually say you don't get core. This is a tough love, but we can back it with data, which is what I really want. To say, look, the fact that you don't pass this feature, but 90% of our deployments use it or expect it, we are going to have to bounce you
So
out.
are we going to do 90% of deployment? Like, are we comparing private clouds to service providers? Right? If 90% of private clouds use a feature, right? Like, all of a sudden you're going to go bully the two service providers that have the biggest OpenStack
Well, I
installs
think
to
that has to be
install
part of
those.
this. I think that has to be part of the debate, right? I mean,
Just
ultimately,
part
this
of
gets
it.
decided by the community. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think any of this is like the intention is the board sits in a room, comes
Right,
up with a
yeah.
list, and says, okay, thou shalt. Right? I mean, I do think it's going to be a discussion. I think some places there's going to be some hard discussions, right? Where there are going to be things that limited number of people haven't implemented that are big players that are going to have to decide if they're going to step up and do it or not. But I also think that's part of what we have to do. I mean, I think there is a fundamental operating premise within the board, and it's what we're hearing from the community, what we're hearing from the customers, is one of the principal value propositions of OpenStack is that there is an ecosystem that is interoperable, that there is some value to having OpenStack deployed in more than one place and using it in a way that's very different than just picking up any off-the-shelf cloud and deploying it. And so some of this will have to happen, and some compromises will have to be made, or that will never be a reality. And right now, and look, as homegrown examples, right? There are a lot of things about what Rackspace has done with our public cloud that is very different than the traditional implementations. And some of that we're working to fix, and we're going quickly. Some of it we might not fix until we get faced with this kind of dilemma. And there'll be other people who are too, and I think that's actually good. Now, I think if you go to a whole class of things and sort of say, well, we're going to exclude the Zen hypervisor because Zen doesn't support this one feature that KVM does, that's a little broad. But on the other hand, if they were to come in and say, well, wait a minute, everybody's got SSH key pairs and Rackspace doesn't. Rackspace, if you want to certify, you're going to have to pass this test. Go put it in a dome. I think that's a fair.
So is
I
that
might not
argument
like
happening
that,
at the
but
PTL
I
level?
think that's fair.
So that's kind of
Whether
where that
the
is.
PTL ends up making the call, I don't.
Actually,
what
what the part of the conversation here, and the way I see this actually going, which is exciting to me, is the user committee actually. This is added, this potentially added scope and work for the user committee, so it has to go through a vetting process. But the user committee actually is the one collecting the data, and it's the logical place for that conversation to happen, right? The PTL owns what's required, what's not required. It owns getting the tests in and making sure the projects have good test suites. The user committee seems like the place to advocate for making the recommendation if this test should be in or out. And one of the things about this is I don't expect this to be so binary, I'm at 0, I'm at 90. that a lot of projects and a lot of features and capabilities, we're going to see and we should see an increasing adoption rate on these tests. And it encourages vendors to have their users publish their results, right? It encourages us to share information about what tests are passing, which, I found the user committee's work to be incredibly valuable in helping people understand OpenStack. And if we can encourage that behavior in the communities, it seems like a really positive step.
I think also there's a difference in tone. You've mentioned it a few times about the idea isn't to punish and go out, and it's to encourage people to give back. So the idea, if you, let's say some new hypervisor comes out and they want to add it to OpenStack.
Let's use Docker.
So you say you need to pass these tests. If you can do these things, then you're a full-fledged member. So it's a very positive thing. You can get added in as a part of OpenStack. You must pass these tests. Maybe they write some other tests to do some Docker-specific things. Right. That's fine. That's for people using Docker, but those aren't the must-have.
I also think the big thing we're trying to do is, this is much more about protecting the brand from becoming a meaningless word than it is about making the brand exclusive.
Right, and
so it's almost like we want to do the bare minimum that leaves enough value that people see the brand as something useful, as opposed to we're trying to set the bar so high that a very small number of people get in the club. I mean, we're very much on the other end of that scale.
Or that people have to be nervous that if something changes slightly, that somebody's going to come, the trademark police are going to come and whack them on the head. I think you need that capability if there's somebody who does go rogue. They don't give a damn. They just go out and do their own thing and misuse the name and make no effort to comply. Then you can bring the lawyers, like you said. But I think the main thing is you have to, if you keep that positive tone, that this is to grow the community, this is to make OpenStack better, I think it would have a lot higher acceptance, because I think people get nervous when you start saying thou shalt not do this, or
The problem is, though, that there's already prior art within the community with members that won't be named that have tried to do that, basically, because they make sensational headlines to say so-and-so cloud is not really running OpenStack. And so you're going to have that battle. But one thing I want to go back, and something that I've been wrestling with since we've been talking earlier today, is it a reasonable expectation that we will be able to have this set of tests, whether it's RefStack or whatever, for each release, that tests every single piece of functionality to validate that this is actually an OpenStack? That seems a pretty high expectation, especially with the rapid pace of change of some of the projects. So we cut Havana. Is there a lag before we know we can actually test whether or not somebody's actually running Havana? Will those tests actually be ready? Is it a reasonable expectation that that seems to be quite a very high bar and a very difficult task to attain, given that we already have a track record of having a difficult time keeping up with just the basic unit tests and testing the basic functionality that are within most of the major components within OpenStack.
So it's one of the reasons why I want to be very careful as we go through this and make sure we have the dialogues, and board members are already talking about this. It does place a lot of pressure on testing infrastructure, right, and testing and people writing tests. I don't expect, remember, it's only a percentage of the tests.
No, I know.
And the tests that are must pass are going to be known, and they should get extra attention and love, I'm assuming. But there also shouldn't be popping up, right? I would be really troubled if somebody wrote a test in the last month of a release cycle that became a must. There's actually, logistically, it'd be impossible. You couldn't add it. You couldn't say, "Oh, I need this test. It's going to be," and then.
Well, that's going to happen though, because half of the features.
Well,
get added that last month.
By definition, those are must pass.
Like, I actually believe that I believe the likelihood is going to would be more along the lines of new features that get introduced in Grizzly that get wide adoption during the 6-month Grizzly period might become must-pass tests in the Havana cycle.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think you're going to have a bunch of new Havana features that show up in a must-pass list for the Havana release on day one. Because anything that's that new, we don't really know if it should be core or not, right? I actually think
works.
I have a feeling that core usually lag the popular case.
But it does
And
encourage
right now-
people to write the tests early so that they have a way to benchmark.
So then you get into a difficult position. So like, for example, when in this transition that we're still kind of in between Nova Network and Neutron.
Yeah.
So which one is core? And at what point do you switch over? And some groups have adopted Neutron early, and some groups are still running on Neutron.
Mm-hmm.
And so can both be core? Does that make, do you see where I'm going? Because at some point you have to switch over.
Yeah, that's
That is a great
thing,
test
right?
question.
You gotta have them running alongside for a period
I
of
think
time.
It
Because there's
definitely
overlap.
changes the question about deprecation statements.
Right.
And I think, once again, I want to go back to data-driven decisions. And so what I really don't like is us to speculate it or to drive a stake in the ground. We are deprecating the code at Grizzly because that's what we think is the right thing to do. I'd much rather be able to say, you know what, 60% of our deployments are still passing the Nova Network tests. We better hang on to those things because they're still widely in use. And only 20% are passing Neutron tests. Wow, we need to work on adoption for that. And part of the thing that I'm hoping to see is that we can actually start collecting that data and having somebody raise their hand and say, okay, this test never passes for me. There's a problem with that, right? Or just, does that make sense? I want to have data to make these decisions because I know, talking about just people on the board, we can't agree on is this core or not. But I know I can talk about one use case, and I know if you can come up, one task, and we can talk about those much more rationally.
One question I have, and it was touched on when people have said interoperability, and you mentioned SSH, is a big part of it is images. In order for a cloud to be useful, you need images, you need instances. Do the tests extend into what those images can do at all? Is that taken into consideration? The prime example being Cloud Init, and what it can do for you.
And this is back to, it depends on what's in use and what people feel like is important. I want to have the tests. Whether or not that test is required, it should be based on whether or not people expect it to work.
But I do think what we have said is these are not just API validation tests, right? There has to be behavior validation beyond that. And certainly a Cloud Init case may be one we say, you know what, you've got to be able to boot a Cloud Init image. It's got to work. You've got to have a metadata service. You've got to, whatever those list of things are that I think can potentially go beyond. Because look, if I just validate that I can make a call and build a server, that doesn't, that's
But you can't
actually,
do anything
to some
useful with
degree,
it.
that's a better start than where we are today, because at least we know that the same call builds a server. But that has to evolve pretty quickly into the kind of things that developers count on. That says, well, not only can I build a server, but I log into it a certain way, and it's going to have a certain, and to some degree, I think in the early days, it's less about whether this is ideal, but it just starts to set a framework of what we're promising people. And the promise may be pretty low at the beginning. The promise may be, look, if you're running OpenStack, we're only promising this basic set of functionality, and then over time, we layer that up so that it gets richer and richer and richer. I think the problem is right now we can't promise anything. Right now what we hear is, well, everybody says they're running OpenStack. I don't know what any of that means. Even if we only got to 10% of the functionality, and they grew to 20, 30, hopefully we'll get higher than that. But I think it'll evolve that way. But I do think it has to get to the point that says, things that get on the question on the table is, will a Cloud Init-based image run in your cloud? Right now it'd be great if it just said, if you run OpenStack, I know that I can upload an image in a certain format and boot from it. And then maybe I'm booting from it and it's Cloud Init. And then maybe I'm booting from it and it's Cloud Init and it has an Ubuntu user that I know my keys are dropped into and works a certain way. All of which, I think the further we get down that path, the better it is. I think we're probably going to have to be okay with starting low on that bar and working our way up. But those are definitely what we see in the future at some point is behavioral characteristics that go beyond. What we don't want to just do is say, you got an API, you can call the API and get a return code back. We got to have something that's more, I do believe, this has not been stated, but I do believe at some point things like how long it takes to boot an instance ought to be within the realm of at least what's reported, if not required, right? Because it's like, great, I made a call and I built a server and an hour later it shows up. That may not be what we want OpenStack to stand for, but eventually I think it's up to all of us to decide how we want to do that. But
The Mechanical Turk version of OpenStack.
Yeah, exactly. I need time to go plug the server in. Give me a break, Troy.
Every call generates a ticket.
Yeah.
It's super ironic.
Yeah, I feel like there's two kind of opposing, so there's the idea that to get good interoperability between OpenStack clouds, you want as much test coverage as possible. But then that starts to err on the side of, becoming core makes this, it's this elitist club that only a few people, and so, I think those two things are kind of at odds a little bit. And so somehow we're gonna have to figure out how we find the sweet spot there. Ultimately, I think if we have a minimalist enough definition of core, I don't necessarily know that the definition of core has to evolve on the same release schedule that the projects do. And I think it might behoove the community to separate those two things out and have a different cadence for the evolution of what is core than the release process. I think that solves some of these issues about things coming in the middle of release cycles and
Having to worry about that every 6
things
months
like that.
would be
Exactly.
insane for anyone running
Exactly.
like a 10,000 server cloud.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you got to change your hypervisor.
So I think that goes back to the design.
Well, so we talked earlier about this idea of, do we really, so I'm still struggling too with this idea of, do we really need core? Can it just be OpenStack? And something I keep going back to is, I wonder if a better start would be less talking about what core should be, and more talking about the individual components and how we can validate those individual components, and maybe having trademarks around, I can say I'm running OpenStack Compute, OpenStack Storage, OpenStack Object Storage, whatever those might be, and get those first, right? And then I think once you're collecting the data, we have those basic components worked out of how we can define whether or not, then we get a much better idea, and I think the market will tell us much more about whether or not we even need core or need some definition of core.
That's a very rational question, and I think it's a logical statement. The challenge is that we have a legal requirement to define it. So unless we change the bylaws.
Right. Well, that's an option too, right? Then maybe it's easier to change the bylaws than define core.
I hope.
That's why we're changing the rule.
Obviously, you haven't worked on a 24-member
Well,
board.
couldn't you do both? I mean, you say, okay, we're going to define these components, and then pick 3 and say these are the components that are core.
Pick
and-
those 3.
So there is.
Well,
I've heard
maybe,
this.
I don't know.
I've heard. So here's the, you guys are. I mean, and this is really exciting to me because what we're saying is logical and digested. You're moving towards. Oh, okay. I understand how things are going to be core, and now I'm like, okay, well that means that the trademark core is going to shrink because it's interoperability spec, and now I'm going to have variants, and we're going to have to deal with that. And I've had really good discussions with people saying, well, okay, this is going to make sense. Now you're going to need a OpenStack for hosters, and an OpenStack private cloud, and an OpenStack for big data, and we're going to end up with test suites that are defined that pass in general for this case. Those are possible. What we don't want to do is have to have that conversation yet, because and this is the fun thing to me is that you guys are past debunking whether or not this is a practical idea, and you're into some of the implications of it.
I still think we need to define, we haven't done it yet. I still think we still have to define what core is, because I hear people talking about when you change core from release to release, and to me, kind of inherent the definition of something being core is that it doesn't change very much.
Yeah.
If
Well,
it's
that's
core,
what the test
it's like a
says,
core
right?
value, right? If a company came to you, we change our core value every 6 months, was it really? How low was that value to you?
And I wouldn't expect these things. I would think that once we've passed a test as must pass, it's going to be pretty hard to want to change it. You're going to have to show that.
Well, the
it's
other
only
reality,
added, right?
the other reality
Or
that
most
plays into
of it.
this
Probably.
that I think everybody has to keep in mind is, for better or worse, core is defined. There are a set of things that are core today that we call core. The problem is we have no way of changing and evolving that or tying it in any way to anything useful. And so, I mean, maybe we don't ever have to do that, but I mean, there are a set of projects that are known as core, and then there's integrated. And so the questions we always get are the projects that are core really should be core any longer? And what about these new projects that really should get into core? How do they get in there? And we have to deal with that question. Unless we just deal with it by saying core goes away completely and we just have a whole collection of projects, which I mean, it's not a possibility.
I think both of you alluded to it. You want the core to be something that's stable and just solid. And if that's the case, you don't want a lot of change. And if that is the case, then the tests that pass continue to pass, regression tests. And if they break, there's just a culture to go fix it. And so that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I do think, to pick up on that thought, because I was having a discussion with another OpenStacker today about this idea of how do we innovate more inside of OpenStack? Because we do have a problem today where there's this idea of you get it and you build it and then it's done and it stays forever. And it would be nice in some projects to experiment more. Maybe you try 2 or 3 different ways of doing something until you figure out what works well, and then one stays and the other 2 go away. But there's almost no way to ever make anything go away. And as I was thinking about this idea of core evolving more slowly than the project, this might become a mechanism that allows innovation. It says, look, the project is adding new stuff and features and capabilities of projects at a rate that slopes like this, but core changes like this. And if we could start to do that, that might give us a mentality to say, you know what, we're launching a new feature here, and it's not core. In fact, we don't even know, we're going to launch it in 3 different ways, and none of them are core.
Right.
You tell us which one, and let the marketplace determine which is core. And then at some point, because that's one of the things that always resonated with me is, talking about representations in sort of the other places, right? IP tables didn't start out as being mandated as a feature of Linux. There were lots of people that built capabilities to manage firewall type behaviors in Linux, and then when IP tables became used by 80% of the people out there to do it, it became part of Linux. And one of the things that I think we don't do well in OpenStack right now is allow innovation to happen in sort of a competitive way. We have a tendency to pick one project or one way of doing things, decide early on that it's right, and deploy it without any marketplace feedback or customer feedback. And it may be, and I hadn't thought of this before, but it may be that we begin to use this core mechanism as a way of sort of differentiating between what's happening in an innovation layer versus, this is the stuff you can depend on that's going to be here forever. Right. And if we do that, then I do believe the bar for getting into core should be very high. I mean, and it should start to change the way to think about it. So I'm just sort of thinking out loud, and I think that's good feedback.
It's very analogous
very much.
in the Python world, inclusion in the standard library. That seemed to be like the goal of every project, to become part of the standard library.
Yeah.
But a lot of projects found out that once you were in, you couldn't change very easily. You were kind of stuck because now everyone was depending on that. Whereas if you were outside, you could continue to evolve and innovate. The other problem is that a lot of things got in the standard library early that kind of sucked, and it was impossible to take them out, And
right.
so, that kind of goes to what Troy was saying. How do you know which is the best implementation until you have a few competitors out there?
And that was, a little trip down memory lane. I mean, the API extension design was implemented exactly to do that, and it just never made it that way. It just the community never embraced that approach, and so now we're sitting here having this conversation 3 years later.
Meaning why deployment gets...
Well, it also goes back to one of the things Rob's always talked about is, how do you make it so that you don't feel like you're not important if you're not in core? I mean, some degree that almost starts to place a penalty on. I mean, you don't want to go into core because by the time you're in core, you lose a lot of your elbow room. You lose a lot of your innovation space. And there are certain projects that may not want to enter into that until they're really ready to lock it down. Other things maybe so. And it may anyway. It's a helpful way to think about as we discuss this. Maybe a way to use that outside of purely just sort of a branding place, but even just a way of ourselves of saying. Because I like the idea of evolving core slowly and also putting a really hard lock around it that says, look, you don't break backward compatibility core. Yeah. That's not an option. Once it's locked down, it is. Because I think I don't think we can do that for everything in OpenStack, but we should probably do it for lots of parts of OpenStack.
And this is how you're going to really get enterprise to embrace you, is by defining core and allowing me to go to Dell and buy an OpenStack. And then I have a new relationship with HP and go and buy an OpenStack and have them still work. I don't actually care if Rackspace is core or not, because I can stop paying them $1 an hour, for instance. Right? I'm not locked into them. Okay, I might have a 3-year contract, but for the way most clouds work, I pay per hour. So if they suddenly become out of core or suddenly go into core, that doesn't really add or remove value for me. What adds or removes values for me is when I buy an OpenStack from HP or an OpenStack from Dell or an OpenStack from the Crazy Russians, it should work. Like, I should buy the base OpenStack and it should work. It should work roughly the same as everything else.
The one place I would push on a little bit is if you're writing code to do that, it would be nice to know that that code, if you aimed it at Rackspace, would behave in the same way that it would if you worked against those others too.
Yeah, I mean, the ecosystem you want.
Interoperability, and at the time we started this, the interoperability debate was really flaring. It seems to have died down a little bit. Maybe not. Maybe it'll come back as soon as the release gets closer.
Everybody's distracted by this.
Feature freeze is
conversation.
done.
I thought they were distracted by the Amazon API discussion.
There are plenty of companies solving interoperability above these stacks, right? I can go to Clicker, I can go to Instratus, I can go to RightScale, and they're going to solve a lot of that interoperability problem for me. And as an enterprise, I don't necessarily want to be putting a lot of effort into solving that problem myself, because, I mean, the company I work for makes video games. So if I have 50 people that are working on developing and supporting OpenStack, that's 50 people that are making video games, right?
So,
and so to me, it's,
right.
I pay these guys
the balance
$5 an instance to do it for me, and so I can focus my people on
And
adding
for those
value.
companies that are doing that, like RightScale or whatever, it's nice for them to know that they got something that they can count on.
Yeah, but that's also what they get paid to do, right? They get paid to fix the small differences between them.
and one of the things that we want to encourage is for people to test past the differences, do things. But I think that there is a value in somebody buying a cloud from Dell and somebody buying one from HP that say they're OpenStack and being able to have some certification that says, okay, this is OpenStack and this is OpenStack, and knowing it. And those differences matter for tools like Fog or Stratius or any of these things that are above the layer. And Fog is a great example. Fog has versions for OpenStack, for Rackspace, and for HP, right? I think those are starting to get normalized, but
Kyle just left.
Sorry. That was a twist in the sword.
But the thing,
right. I mean, but that is a fail for OpenStack as a community, right? And so if whatever those differences are, we build tests and then say, okay, I'm going to make sure that you pass, and Fog works against something that passes the test. You want the expectation that that's going to, Fog would work, OpenStack Fog would work against anybody who passed the tests. And it's not simple to do, but it leads to, we're driving in that direction.
If I pass the core tests, are we saying that those clouds are interoperable? Is that
No.
by, I mean,
No.
It almost seems like the core tests just are like defined behavior, and you have undefined.
Yeah, the behavior.
Maybe eventually, maybe we can build.
I think it has to evolve to that.
So here's the goal.
Yeah.
We have to move in that direction. We don't have to start at that point. And this to me is the key to a good definition of core is if it's driving us, if it's creating a practical way to drive towards interoperability that everybody can say, okay, if I do this thing, it moves us in that direction. Last year at the last summit, we had a lot of enthusiasm around interoperability, and short of RefStack, which didn't quite get us there, is we had no way to actually drive community behavior towards interoperability. And right, core is important. It has trademark implications, as business and commercial implications, but it's got to also have community implications to be successful. And I can tell you, if we can't get the pocketbooks aligned and sitting as a community guy on the board with, 16 commercially funded people, if I can't make a pocketbook discussion out of this, then it's going to fail, right? It's right. Everybody's paid to work on OpenStack. Most of us are paid to work on OpenStack, and so we have to have commercial alignment.
The other thing I think about with interoperability, besides just moving work, theoretically move workloads around, is that to me, if I buy an HP cloud or a Dell cloud or Rackspace cloud, and something new innovation comes in, like let's say Trove, I should be reasonably expect that Trove will work in the cloud I have without me having to do major changes to the code because someone has customized it so much that it doesn't actually work with the project.
And so Michael on PDL Trove.
Yeah.
From the Trove perspective, I would actually like to see that I can spin up a a Galera cluster between two different cloud providers and not care. But at the same time, that's something that we can also, I guess, I don't know, I'm still kind of mixed on the whole idea. But I do understand that, so I would like to see that from Trove too, to be able to say, yeah, these guys can say, put, multi-AZs, multi-providers, let's put a Galera, I mean, that may not be feasible, but let's say a Cassandra cluster across, 3 different companies. That would be neat too.
Well, I'm looking at it from an enterprise perspective, right? So for example, I was just at a big customer today who wants to go into OpenStack, but they're committed to, in this case, the dual vendor strategy. Mm-hmm. So what they want to know is, whether it's Trove or some other project, if they use those 2 different vendors, OpenStack, they can actually spin it up on both. And reasonably expect that will all work without having to do major, changes.
Well, a lot of customers are doing Amazon and some OpenStack provider, right? So they're already basically maintaining 2 stack.
Some are. Yeah.
Some are, not everybody. And I would hope that would change over time to be OpenStack and OpenStack
Well,
and OpenStack.
yeah. And right now, quite honestly, it's no harder to do Amazon and somebody's OpenStack than it is to do 2 OpenStacks, right? I mean, and I think part of what we believe is there's an opportunity to make it so easy to go OpenStack to OpenStack that people might not want to mix that. And we'll see whether it happens or not. But I mean, just speaking from the Rackspace side, right? We need this because we have debates between our private and public. I mean, our private and public clouds don't look alike, let alone, HP and Rackspace look alike. And we've got to get better at that. And I'd love to say we could do it and never have to put, this kind of program in place, but that's, I think that's going to be part of what we're trying to do.
Unix.
But if we can just get into this kernel.
As you're defining it at a meta level, like you have API, you have behaviors, how about things that are standard to interoperate, for example, an image format, right? Where does that fall under? I'm just trying to figure out groupings of things that are generic but still captures the essence of.
It's a good question.
Whatever.
This is the place where people get frustrated by my answer, right? Which is, we need to have tests that validate it, and then we need to see which people care about which tests.
Right.
I could definitely see a situation, where there's a test where there's a standard image. You need to be able to call glance, upload the image, boot an instance from it, validate that it does certain things, right? And so, which begins to define a standard image format for, or maybe 2 or 3, right? Now, is that going to happen on day 1 of the definition? Probably not. But if we started to write those tests and started to see that those tests were being deployed and used, then that becomes now a car. But I think, for instance, that would be an extremely valuable area to be within Core. Because that's one of the things I hear about is I would love to be able to pull my image out of one cloud and put it in another.
But that also is defining a standard. I mean, if I don't want to ever provide the capability to upload an image, right? It's a matter of course.
Like that's the value to the customer is that I know I can move from one. I don't get vendor lock-in. So this is forcing.
Well, but I think images is a terrible way to avoid that, right? I think configuration management is a much better way of doing that. And I promote that, right? And so to tell me that, okay, now AT&T can't be part of OpenStack and have that brand just because I can't upload an image? Sure.
Well, that would be the argument about core.
But I think that's the debate in the community that we ought to have, right? I mean,
no,
but that's exactly the discussion is, does that become a must-pass test or not? And, look, at the end of the day, somebody's going to lose some of these arguments.
Absolutely.
So somebody's going to believe it absolutely should be. Somebody's going to believe it absolutely
but if they do lose the argument, they will understand that they are in the minority in that deployment, and maybe they should be scratching their head saying.
And we will provide a forum where their voice got heard.
Even the data-driven discussions are a hard question, right? Are we talking about number of people with installed OpenStacks? How many, so Rackspace counts for 1, because we're in private cloud, right? Are we talking about number of nodes? Right? Are we talking about how many users?
This is and so this is the next click down in this dialogue, right? Where we're like, okay, well, this makes sense. Now, how do we determine what a mass pass test is? Which is a great discussion to be having. I don't know, but I would love to be having that debate instead of. You follow what I'm saying?
No, I understand.
Here's a weird paradox. So. The odd thing is all these providers are going to have a hard time being able to say, I'm OpenStack, I run OpenStack Core because of all these weird things. But me running DevStack on my laptop could say, hey, I've got OpenStack, I'm OpenStack Core, or I'm running on one machine at Rackspace, DevStack, and all the tests pass and everything, and say, hey, I'm super awesome cloud.
Here's my public IP address.
Yeah, here's my IP address. I'm running DevStack, and I'm OpenStack Core.
Yes.
Yeah, but
so does that really?
I think we said it before that you would assume that those guys would get busted pretty quickly. Yeah. Right. So like it doesn't protect you against somebody.
But they're following to the T. There's nothing that they're following the contract.
Yeah, but
you
they're
see the
customers,
paradox
yeah.
that I'm saying?
Yeah, I think
it's the people that are really in earnest trying to provide a service to their customers are the ones that are going to feel the brunt of this versus I could just set up DevStack and be, oh, I'm OpenStack Core now.
But they're also the ones that want to charge their customers several $1 million to report.
Yeah. I mean, there are legal ways to screw customers.
Well, no, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying, but do you see the paradox?
I do. I think it's a good point.
I just think we have to ultimately decide if we're chasing the opportunity of creating this the way we want to, or if we're going to not do it because we don't know how. And I can think of a million reasons none of this will ever work, and we could never establish core, and we should just quit tomorrow. But I think most of us believe that there's enough of an opportunity here that we need to start down that path. And look, I think the number of ways that people are going to be able to scheme this and modify it and make it hard are going to be, we haven't even thought of most of them. We're going to find an infinite number of them. I think what we have to do is trust that as a community, we're going to deal with that in the best way that's in the interest of what we're trying to do.
So despite the fact that we will have a core, the ability to say I'm on core, the only real way to know is for the people that are using that software to really, like you were saying, like, hey, this doesn't work worth a damn even though you say you're on core, right? So then to me, that means that, if I was writing, if I was a company that wanted to make money and I, was testing this stuff out on 3 different clouds and only 2 of them were actually interoperable, then I would be in the exact same boat, whether this core branding thing even existed or not, to say, well, these 2 work together, so I'm going to use them. Screw Rackspace because they have their own Keystone implementation. So, I mean, if at the end of the day the only way to really tell is by using it, then what is the point of the brand?
Well, I think that's. I mean, this is where I go.
That's a good question.
If we never get there to where this actually is meaningful, then we do fail. But I guess the question is, if we don't know how to get there from the starting point, do we not start? And I think we as a board are sort of saying, look, we can't get there day one, but that's not a reason to start with something and work towards that goal. So the first version of this is not going to be perfect. It's not going to solve every problem. It's going to have all kinds of holes, and it's not going to be perfect. So does that mean we should never do it?
Yeah, I don't mean just never do it. I just mean is it worthwhile?
Well, but so somebody
sure it's going to be hard.
Yeah, but Mike, so somebody has to go out and do that the first time, but then once there needs to be like some place to go report that, and then there's got to be some little core police that go and tell somebody stuff.
Then we're gonna
so that way you can save like
OpenStack.
so the next person doesn't have to go through the same
I'll
trouble.
tell you, the user community has been very vocal that they want this.
Yeah.
Right, we're hearing that from the user committee. I hear it from Rackspace customers. I hear it from the.
Well, we've been at a point though for a year or 2 where OpenStack has changed so radically every release. I mean, I think 2 or 3 releases ago, 26 or 28% of the code base changed, and we're still such a new community that half the shit we used to push to the core things wouldn't even work out of the gate, because we didn't have tests for them. So, maybe just the maturity of the projects and having the testing infrastructure and having the CI/CD guys working, that is going to vet itself out. And it's, maybe that was a problem a year ago. Maybe in 2 years, it's not going to be a problem because Nova is going to work.
Yeah. Well,
I would love to be in a situation 2 years from now where we are completely differentiated in the market because we not just work, but because we have an amazing test suite that sets the standard for what an open source project regression suite should be.
Well, sure.
Because that to me creates, from an enterprise perspective, that creates a huge differentiated value, right? If I'm looking at a proprietary cloud infrastructure, and they're like, yeah, we test it internally, we have all this stuff, we run it, no problem, just take our word for it, it's great. it's a totally different ballgame if you're like, look, we actually have a growing community-based community tests, and when AT&T got burned because somebody changed something, then they wrote a test and they put it in, and people are like, oh, that test, that burned me too. I want that test in.
But at the same time, that doesn't mean that your operations engineers can run it worth a damn. You know, like I can say I'm core, and my API goes down every 15 minutes.
Completely
but
right.
Guys, you know, I've been quiet for the most part, but this has been a really good discussion, but I think we're trying to feed too much into this idea of core. I mean, this is intended to be as inclusive as everything else we've done. This isn't intended to be exclusive. This isn't intended to say who's cool, who's inside the inside club, or any of those things. It's intended to help protect the brand of what is OpenStack, and to help people, but not necessarily be the only definition of who can interoperate, who can work together. So don't tie so much into this before we've even, you know, we're just getting started and trying to figure out what this could be. Don't poke too many holes in what it's not already, because we haven't even figured out the basics of what it could be. So there's a lot of stuff that still needs to be done, and just think about the fact that we're having these discussions out in the open. Has any other group done this before? Has anybody else ever had their board meetings in the wide open? No. So don't get too negative too quickly. Just in fact, I want you guys to get in and really beat the crap out of the tests. That's what we need. We need people to dig in and say, hey, we need these tests. We need these things. I'm not so sure about service level offerings, you know, being able to say that, you know, if you don't respond within a few minutes that you're not part of core, or that you don't pass the test. But that's my definition of that. Shouldn't be the only answer. It should be the community and everyone that's in this room and outside of the community making that definition. So
That's kind of the point about
my 2 cents.
Also, we have to be realistic about time frames, right? I mean, this discussion sort of germinated in February. We're this far along. We have a PowerPoint slide.
It seems like
It's going to be a long time before we have
I mean, it seems like it's really an open source definition, right? It's kind of an open source definition. And as the community, the board is kind of coming up with a framework. We've got PTLs that are putting in their input. We've got the user community that's involved, and everybody's, you know, if we, you know, we treat this like we would treat Nova or Swift or any other component of the framework, and say,
So
how do we
does
improve this and make
core
this
become
better?
core then?
Can core run on core?
Can we do a core incubated followed by core integrated? No, sorry.
You can do that with Docker.
It's a program.
Actually, there's this. I guess this is the blueprint. The
And
core
commit it
blueprint.
into Stack Forge.
But I think the point of having the discussion in the open makes everyone who's involved in OpenStack aware of the issues, and will tend to keep them aware of when they veer away from
And I actually want to, you know, I love that you guys are pressure testing this, right?
Yeah.
This is essential. The thing that we fail at is if we come back and we're like, hey guys, here's the tablets, here's core, done.
Yeah.
Right, you know, we've got to be able to say, well, what if this happens? What if that happens? As long as you're like, okay, I'm testing you to make sure that this is reasonable, and I love that. We've got to do it. I want you guys to keep doing it, right? And be aware that this is still in flight, and we're going to do it. Tend towards have you considered this? Is this a way to solve that problem? But and actually, this is getting good to I don't want us to go all night, especially since but. There's something I end all these conversations with as a request, right? Is that please take this away. You guys are representatives for the community. Continue the dialogue. Make sure that you tell people that you were part of this dialogue, right? That you sounded these ideas out. They make sense to you. If you have concerns, bring them, right? We had after the San Francisco one, we had a really great long dynamic chat on Twitter. Some of the classic voices about naysayers chimed in on stuff, and we had back and forth. We're not trying to make everybody happy, we can't. But we are trying to make sure that if people have issues that we bring them up and where we can address them, we do.
I think one of the things that I picked up from the conversation this evening is that you need to carefully define what you're not trying to do, as well as what you are trying to do. I mean, basically, you want to stop people selling OpenStack toasters. You want to actually have OpenStack mean something.
I would buy it.
That's part of it.
So the whole interoperability thing is not a target. So you need to be upfront and clear, so people will say, "Oh, okay, then I can't come here to think about that."
And that is feedback I've gotten in other places. I will put together a list of things that it's not, right? One of the other things that is we are clearly not defining here is a mark for people who pass the tests but don't implement OpenStack code. There are people who care about that very deeply. We are not. That is not the core. We are not deciding that yet, right?
Right.
So we owe you. We actually owe the community, and I'll work on this. We owe the community a list of, and we did this with the InkUp, and it was really effective. InkUp was the incubation, the thing that described incubation and integrated releases and stuff like that. We said we're not describing what core is in this project, and so we will come back and describe these are things that we are not trying to address. Interoperability is one of them.
Initially.
Initially,
anyway, yeah.
We're hoping to make progress, but right for now, in November we have to have a resolution on this, and one of the things we're not resolving is other uses of the trademark. Not resolving.
And that may very well just be up to the marketing team that's paid by the foundation to come up with that stuff. I mean, that's what we pay them for.
Right.
I have a concern, and you can tell me that's not a concern, that'd be great.
Yeah.
So my concern is how are we making sure that in these discussions we're having, that end users are getting adequate input? Because I've been to a lot of meetups now, and the reality is mostly vendors that attend.
Yeah.
And so if this becomes the only forum, and I'll say it is, then we risk not hearing the users.
I guess I'm the token end user here, so.
Yeah. Why not?
We're covered for this meeting.
So I would love suggestions on how to engage a broader audience.
Isn't that the user community?
Sorry?
The user community? The user community is, not really existent. Right? There's really no such thing.
There is an active
Kind
user
of.
committee, but it doesn't do it. We don't really have great ways to reach out to the users per se, except what we're trying to do. Right? We've posted this on blogs. We're trying to reach the community. We're trying, and you guys are part of a broadening spectrum, right? We actually are titrating. It's one of my favorite words. Sorry. We're starting small and trying to expand this, because what I don't want to do is I don't want to show up at a 100-person user event and somebody to say, "Oh, have you guys considered this?" and us be like, "Oh, that would have been obvious." So we started in OSCON with a small event. With San Francisco, we had a bigger event. You guys are about the same size as San Francisco. You're asking great questions. I will tell you, you're turning over some new rocks, but you're turning over a lot of rocks that we've heard before, which means we have to do a better job documenting them. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with that. What it means is that we're getting to a point where we've actually hit, we've hit this, and we can start educating people more broadly. And I think our key for the user interactions is getting this to a point where a broad number of people have heard it. They've sniff tested it. You guys are not nuts. This makes sense. We've documented the issues that people have had, and we've made it digestible, right? There'll ultimately be a what is core graphic novella, probably.
Yeah. So I think, for example, that whole image portability thing, right, that we're kind of debating back and forth. At the end of the day, maybe the people who would actually use the clouds that we're building, they may come back and say that is actually the most important thing.
Well, I would also expect the vendor to,
right?
I know we sit in meetings with customers every day and they tell us what they need, right? And so I'm here advocating for that because that's how I sell my stuff.
Well,
if I'm not meeting what they want, they're not coming. So.
I think to some degree, as we get to the next level of actually starting to talk about what functionality is covered, what areas need to be included in must-pass tests, those types of things. we have to figure out a way to get a lot of user input into that process.
And it could come back to, we do what we do for conference sessions, right? We're like, here's all the use cases, go vote on these things.
The best thing that's come out of the user committee to date was actually all the usage statistics that they gathered through surveying the user base. So while there's not, you know, I mean, Tim and Ryan and the guys that are on that committee are small as a committee, they have been able to reach out to get sort of survey and question data from a fairly wide audience. So, you know, maybe what we do at some point is kind of go, okay, you know, if we're going to focus on these tests, you know, here's 10 areas, rank them 1 to 10, and where do you think they are? And, you know, we probably have ways of getting to users and getting some feedback, because there's a lot of data that came back in those original usage statistics that people shared, you know, how they're using it, what systems they're using, how big they are, what hypervisor. I mean, got a lot of good data out of that. So.
And one of the things that we're trying to do is create real motivation for vendors to encourage their users to share this data, because that actually helps us build the knowledge and the tests and things like that. So,
I just want to reiterate what
yeah.
is saying, right? And we've had a lot of debates about the point you made. You know, those customers who are very used to DevOps and Chef Puppet configuration, they go that way. But we constantly hear from customers who are not there yet, who still want to.
Oh, I get that from mine all the time. I just say no.
and so the getting a user.
See, I told you that was the answer.
Just tell them no.
So getting some feedback.
Portability is Chef.
But this is, we are crossing over into enterprise customers who have a different standard and operating model.
Yes.
And
yes.
we're going to be working that through.
Yeah. Maybe another 15 years before they get that.
Well, look at maybe
decades.
Well, I also think the way that probably happens is you probably end up in a scenario where there's a version of Core that comes out that doesn't require image portability and upload, but there's a set of tests that you score on.
Right.
And you can go to vendors and say, well, I know it's not Core, but I have it. And eventually, eventually if he's not getting any business because everybody's going to you because you have it,
right.
then he's got a decision to make, right? And then maybe we decide how that evolves to Core.
Yeah.
I mean, in my mind, that's how this evolves, is the marketplace really is what determines. Now, how we measure that is harder to do in reality than conceptually. Like, I think in a perfect world, it evolves that way.
So, but at the end of the day, how does that depend on saying, like, the marketplace is going to drive these things? How does that depend on saying, this is based on the thing that is called Core, right? Look, if this guy's not offering me to upload images, I'm going to go to you because I need to upload images. Whether or not you say, I am this Core thing, I've got this stamp of approval, this wax thing that I've heated up, you know? I mean,
well, but you might not if there's some core feature that I actually don't support.
Sure, but at the end, but it's going to be up to me to decide whether I need these things having nothing to do with this special.
So part of what, to me, the thing we're trying to encourage is that we build a test that certifies that behavior, that use case that I find important, right? And if that's an SLA or a time, I don't care. I want those tests to show up in OpenStack community, right? They might not be Tempest tests. They might be whitebox. I don't care. I want those tests to show up, and then you can run those tests. It's in Rackspace's favor to have Trove performance tests in the community so that anybody can run them, so that when RefStack runs them, or somebody else, you can actually, that would be an automatic benchmarking. Mm-hmm. And so whether or not that has to be Core, it doesn't. Right. But if we've created a culture that values testing, and then it makes it easy for you to add a test that allow, that customers find valuable.
Yeah.
We have a huge win.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
And
that is amazingly awesome.
Good.
My only question is, how at the end of the day, are these orthogonal thoughts, right? The testing thing that is awesome, that would be lovely to have, that we can run, right. And this, wax stamp that is Core.
So the thing that to me is really exciting about this definition is that it makes them come into alignment. That we actually have a value for people who want that Core stamp to be testing participants versus just, oh, I know exactly what I need to do for OpenStack. I will do that thing and get the stamp and I'm happy. And if we do that, to me, it doesn't drive back community behavior and contributions and things like that. So they could be orthogonal. What I'm hoping to do is align them. Because at the end of the day, the tests are the use cases, which the users value, which people find, that's the business value that we're building.
Absolutely.
And so if I can align those things, which is the way I feel like we're talking, then we've got a good thing. If I fail to do that, I might define, like today I feel like we've done this. We just defined all the projects at the time of foundation as core projects. I can tell you people feel very strongly that those are not a complete list or an overly complete list or a...
Maybe a little more than that.
I actually think it's big. I mean, if we got to the point where everybody ignored core and started paying attention to test reports and said, well,
that's exactly what I was going to say.
That'd be great.
That's even
I was going to say, I think the more important thing,
how do we actually get there?
I think the more important thing at the end of the day is that we have some sort of test to validate the functionality and features of each cloud that is OpenStack, and that is highly visible and easy for people to run. That is way more important to me than having then that define some sort of set of core, right? And I think if we focus on that more and then get the data like what you're talking about, I think then things will start to become more evident rather than trying to prematurely define what core is. I think we might get there better down the road.
Or might see that we don't need it.
Or see that we don't need it, and the market forces immediately look and say, oh look, these support exactly what I need. Oh look, some cloud goes, hey look, they support this and we don't, and we're losing customers to them, so we need to support it. Or some app comes out that says that is everybody's using, but our cloud doesn't support it. So I would much rather have visibility and market forces driving features and functionality rather than just some definition that the PTLs have made up of what core should be.
So I totally, can I respond real quick? I totally agree with what you're saying. That is exactly what we will and need to do, because obviously we wouldn't be able to come up with some arbitrary definition of what is core by next month or even in 6 months. We don't know exactly how we're going to come up with the details of what is core. But the thing that we have to do is at some point in the near future, we have to come up with what the brand of OpenStack means and be able to define it in some way so that the people with money don't walk away from this effort and we end up with, not what we have today, something less than we have today. So if we don't work towards keeping the companies that are pouring money into this effort interested, that they have something viable that they can sell and interest their customers in purchasing and having a long-term relationship, we will lose. So we have a huge opportunity here over probably the next year to maybe even outside of 2 years to come up with a really awesome working definition of what is core and a really robust set of tests, much like we have with Monty and team of what's been done with the CI pipeline is really unprecedented and super awesome. We can do the same thing with the testing environment as well. I have all the confidence that we can. But we don't want to alienate the companies that are pouring money into this right now. And they have to have something they can sell to their customers that means something. And unfortunately, that means a trademark. So that's something that's mixed into this.
Yeah, I suspect what will happen too is once the foundation defines what's core, that becomes, for good or ill, it becomes a checkbox for the end users. So what they're going to say is, well, there's so many vendors out there selling OpenStack. One quick way for me now, the choice down is I'm only going to pick the vendors that have been certified as core, right? So
but then it costs money potentially to get, the resources to get certified by core, and the small vendors are going to have. And I understand that there is a need for the companies that are funneling millions of dollars into this in order to give them a piece of the pie back, right? Like to be able to give this brand out, but I don't know. It just doesn't seem necessarily as fair.
Why don't we err on the side of liberality a bit? And yes, we get diluted a bit, but it's a lot easier to then, after we have data, to start to constrain that in. And to me, the market forces will weed out a bunch of that already for you, right? If someone says they're OpenStack, people are going to find out really quickly that either they are or aren't, or there's some level of functionality they do or don't provide. and are very quickly going to determine, it's not going to be because they have some core, meet some core functionality or not, isn't going to do that, right?
So I strongly agree with your vision of where things go. I completely, right? You and I have talked about this.
I know.
I am a huge test advocate, right?
Right.
I believe in test first, all these things. I think when I talk to people who are not in that mindset, it is very hard for them to understand the world that you laid out, which to me makes perfect sense and I can see happening in a couple of years. It's very hard for them to see how we get there. And part of what we're doing with this is we're giving them a very clear and financially beneficial bridge to that result. So what we're doing is, like, if you don't understand how good tests can be and how people are going to compare products based on test results and real data, and the market will evolve here, if that's too big a leap for you, and unfortunately I think it is a big leap for people who don't, there are, for a significant number of people in this, especially the non-community focused money interests in OpenStack, and God bless them, we need them. They pay for stuff.
You're for OpenStack? Yeah, come on in. Oh, no, that's actually next door.
And
I'll be there in a minute.
And so, it's a good little speaker system. That's why.
Sorry about that, guys.
No worries. It's just your voice comes out of the box. It's sort of cool. So what happens is that it creates a bridge. And so, right, but what you're doing to me is exactly the test that we want with this. If you say, oh, overall we're driving in a direction, this drives in a direction where we don't need core definitions at all, I actually see that as a likely outcome, as a success outcome. In the short term, there's commercial interests that understand core, and they will put up with the fact that we're using tests to define it, and might actually play. And so this is our carrot, if you will, to help bring people along into the mindset that you already have because you've seen the positive effect.
And then get back to what the users want, right?
Right.
And I mean, if we may think, yeah, the testing is much more important than the core branding.
Yeah, but
What's
this
at the
isn't
end
about the users, right? It's
It is
about
about the
the
users.
money. Right, it is.
Well,
Totally. But in the beginning, the defining core is not about the users. It's about the
Core is just a
people.
word. It's the minimum
that,
feature set that if OpenStack means nothing to a customer, I think. I don't think they care if it's open source. It makes me feel good, but in the end, I don't really care. And I
Right.
think, but what I do care about is that I don't get locked into one company or another, like I am with Amazon. And so if I can say I can move from HP to Dell to Rackspace to whatever, and I know this is the minimum feature set, okay, that means something to me as a customer. And right now, I don't have that.
Sure, and we're not going to get that up front, right? We're
But we
going to
can.
define
This is the
I
way
think
something.
we're going to get a portion of that. If we don't get any of that, then why bother at all?
What does OpenStack mean?
What I
Well, but what the conversation that just happened was, well, it doesn't really matter if we get any of that up front. What matters is that we keep the vendors that are pumping the project happy up front.
Well,
Which is not,
Because those are the people that care. Those are the people that have a timeline on this process, right? Those are the people that have a time window that they're boxing us in on.
I think you're overreading.
I work for one of those vendors, so
I work for one of those vendors too, and I know the reason. I know the reason we want core is we want it to mean something. We want the interoperability component. Now, when I say we're not going to get interoperability, does that mean we're going to get all the interoperability that every user wants in the first pass of core? No, I don't think so. I don't know that we'll solve the image problem, but we better damn well solve 80% of the core API that people know they can write code against is going to be the same somewhere. We got to solve whether floating IPs are in or out, whether SSH keys and console logs, and whether glance should be served. I mean, there's a lot of very basic stuff that I actually don't think is onerous for everybody to support. It doesn't put a huge drag onto people that would be very meaningful for people, and a very good starting point that doesn't have to be completely arbitrary by some guys in the back room, right? And so, yes, there could be a scenario, but Rob said what we wanted to do was come out with the tablets that the big money guys dictated this is going to be it and everybody's going to follow. We could have done it that way, and I think that's where we're going. I disagree that we should sort of say interoperability is not dealt with. I think we should say it's not completely solved by this, but I do think Core is trying to solve some of the interoperability problems, at least to a step.
I think we need to be more explicit that the primary stakeholder in this entire process has got to be the end consumers of OpenStack clouds. Whether those are people, ecosystem companies that are developing or individual consumers. And we just have to make sure that we're positioning that very clearly, because that wasn't the way that some of those comments just came across.
And I appreciate the feedback on that, right?
Yeah.
And this is the balance in this conversation. One of the things that's interesting to do, and you guys we're just about talking about it, and I think it is worth, and then we need to shut down. Is thinking through what it's going to take for us to define the first set of must-pass tests. And I think that there's probably a significant, there's a set of tests that I think we're going to very quickly say, yeah, these are must. We know these. And I think there's a whole bunch that we're going to say no. And I think there's a small contentious set that for all simplicity, we will probably not adopt. And then we'll go through a vetting process on that. So, imagine 30% of the tests easy, 30% of the tests clearly not. That 30%, we're just not going to take action on them initially, right? And we're going to start collecting data and start having discussions, and
it's kind of the PEP process. And I think put the PEP out, let people get used to it. And, because some of the stuff, like if they put in something that we have to fix, it may take us 6 months to fix it, right? And so having those things just like pop up will be too onerous to kind of.
And we'll end up listening, and this is what I suspect, we'll end up listening to a major cloud provider like Rackspace who says, guys, we're not going to pass any Keystone tests. If you make Keystone required, it's going to suck for us. And we were like, okay, that's in that middle 30%, and we'll.
So then projects or programs are no longer core. It's really about the functionality between a set of them that is defined in core, right? There's no such thing as a core, like Nova's not core, but the 1/3 of Nova that operates with Glance and Keystone together in these environments is now core. And Nova's just a project at that point, just like Trove is. Like personally, I don't want to be core. I am happy with integrated status, but there's no such thing as a status for a project anymore, especially if you start with a small set of tests.
I love that question, and I don't know.
Sure.
I think that one of the things that the board is going to end up having to discuss is if you have one test that's must pass, is that whole project then must?
Sure.
Because at that point you're requiring the framework, right? You're requiring a reference. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes with that. And I think it's going to be a tippy scale where we're not going to have a project with one must-pass test. We're going to say, all right, there's a whole bunch. We're going to sort of build up a certain amount of tests that look like they're candidates, and they're going to come in a batch, and that whole project.
Sure, but does a project even matter? Like, does it matter to have a core project?
You may not have
you need a core ecosystem.
Like you might not have.
Now you're sounding like Chuck, and I agree with where you're going.
All right, it's time to go.
What's interesting is that a core project could actually reach out and make you core, whether you want to be or not, right? So if Keystone says, I'm going to deploy on Trove, Trove has to be available for Keystone to run, and Keystone is core, and it can't pass tests.
No. Only 10% of Trove has to be core.
Well, yes.
The other 90% can just go.
A provider
I think that's where we should be, which is.
Sure, but then core.
There is no such concept like
a project. Project status.
You could sort of say you could from a labeling standpoint sort of say, well, you get to call yourself a core project if any part of you is required to be core. But it does, I think, and this is what I think is I think this is valid, right? I mean, there really only should be parts of Nova that are core and parts of Nova that are still moving.
It should be an ecosystem that is core, not an individual project.
I actually think that's.
And that is the number one thing that surfaces tension in the mind map, and let's use this as a closing point, was we didn't want to compromise innovation and stability. We had to find a way to balance those two things. And what you just said sounds like we're getting closer.
Yeah, that was my idea. Some of the stuff is locked down and some of the stuff is innovating. It shouldn't be that, like now all of Nova is completely can't move because it's core and it hasn't tested that's valid forever. It ought to be some portion of that.
Yeah, but move better goddamn work.
So, yeah.